The first is a fairly influential argument, which fairly certain everybody knows about, the Kalam cosmological argument. And I'm just going to run through the premises real quick. Everything which begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. I already anticipate everybody's saying, well, that's not an argument for God. I will get to that. That's a gap problem, and I will attempt to close it on behalf of the premises. So premise one, everything which begins to exist has a cause. So why should we think that's true in the first place? The first reason would be immense inductive support, right? So when you look around you, you see all these things which begin to exist also have a cause. So what's the unifying explanation for this data set? We can cash that explanation out in terms of a causal premise. And so what would that causal premise be? It would be the premise that everything which begins to exist has a cause. That would explain why everything that we see that has a finite past or begins to exist, same thing, has a cause, right? And we want to find these unifying explanations, right? Because it's not just one instance, two instances. It's an everyday thing. Everything which begins to exist has a cause. So it has that immense inductive support, right? And then the second reason, I hope I'm not going too fast here. Where's all the uncaused stuff, right? So assume, let's say for reductio, things can come into existence from nothing. So what would explain why things don't just start popping into existence uncaused all the time? What sort of thing could explain that? One can't appeal to the laws of nature, physical laws, for example, because they're not governing anything. We're talking about the absence of anything. And when I say nothing, I'm talking about something like the philosophical nothing. I'm not talking about the term nothing as used by scientists sometimes to refer to a vacuum. Instead, I'm talking about the literal absence of anything. So if something could come from that, something could begin to exist from the absence of anything, then why don't things just come from nothing all the time? Again, we want a unifying explanation because every moment that we don't see things popping into existence would be an instance of this, of that question of where's all the uncaused stuff. And so the explanation again can be found in premise one, that everything which begins to exist has a cause. So something just couldn't come from nothing, because then it would be causeless. And then the third reason is intuition. So it's an intuitive premise. I think that's very obvious, that everything which begins to exist has a cause. And in the absence of defeaters, we should think our intuitions are true. So if we intuit that this premise is true, and we have no defeaters whatsoever for it, and we have evidence for it, then we ought to think it's true. That seems like a reasonable position to hold. And so I won't go much further into premise one. I think that's really all I have to say about it. Premise two, the universe began to exist. So there's two things about this one. Ignore the wall of text. The Borguth-Vilenkin theorem, okay? The BGV theorem. Boiled down pretty much to its bones, inflation from eternity entails that you have speeds going faster than light, right? But then as we know, that's impossible. So inflation doesn't occur from eternity. So it occurred past finite, right? Finite time ago. Therefore, the universe began to exist because that Big Bang is just inflation and then expansion, right? That's like the first thing right there, that expansion. And so that began a finite time ago. And so the universe began to exist on the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem because that's what it aims to prove, that the universe is past finite, or however you want to say it. And then we have causal finitism, right? So this is basically sort of proved by reductio, or proved by contradiction, however you want to say it. And there's a few paradoxes that support this, but there's the Grim Reaper's paradox, and I take this from Reasonable Faith. It goes like this. We're invited to imagine that there are denumerably infinitely many Grim Reapers, whom we may identify as gods. Anyways, you are alive at midnight, and Grim Reaper 1 will strike you dead at 1 a.m. If you are still alive at that time, Grim Reaper 2 will strike you dead at 12:30 a.m. And if you are still alive, Grim Reaper 3 will strike you at 12:15, and so on. So such a situation seems clearly conceivable, right? We mentioned conceivability. So it's conceivable, given the possibility of an actual infinite number of things. And you don't have to actually rule out an actual infinite number of things for, in fact, that can exist. But what we do have to rule out now is that an infinite causal series is possible, because if it was possible, then this was possible. And what's the issue with this now? I would say it leads to a contradiction, because by the time it's by the time it's 1 a.m., you must have died because an infinite number of reapers have already come to pass, right? So if you'd have to be dead, right? But which one killed you? None of them could have killed you because for each one that could kill you, there would have to be one before it that killed you. So no Grim Reapers killed you, but you're also dead. There's the contradiction. And the idea is that if you allow an infinite causal series, then this is possible. But surely this isn't possible because anything that entails a contradiction is impossible by extension. So it's not possible. So a step there has to be mistaken. And I would say the mistake here is that we're assuming infinite causal series are possible. Now then, if we say an infinite causal series isn't possible, then you couldn't have an infinite causal history for the universe. It would have to go finite towards the past, right? And then you'd have to have a first cause. And that would suffice for the argument because you'd have a first cause which causes the universe, and causal history is finite.
I'm honestly a bit disappointed to see the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, when it comes to the premises of that specific argument, I have said before that I find these arguments not really relevant to believing in Allah or to believing in Islam. But for the sake of simply engaging with the argument, premise: whatever begins to exist has a cause. Fine, good. That's an observation that you make based on the limited number of observations that you have made so far in the world that we find ourselves in. But that is only a conclusion that we come to because we observe things that we have seen in our lives around us. We don't even know very much about all the objects that surround our Earth, our planet, for example. We have only discovered within the last 100 years that there is an endless universe out there. So you only look at a very specific small number of things to conclude that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay, it is the best explanation that everything that begins to exist has a cause. I think it is a very reasonable explanation to make, but in the end it is simply an assumption. You don't know about the vast majority of the universe. You are only a tiny dot. When it comes to whether the universe came into existence or not, there is a misrepresentation on what is actually being said about the beginning of the universe. The theorem represented concludes that objects in the universe are expanding and therefore separating themselves from each other. That is accompanied with additional evidence for the Big Bang, such as that temperatures on the objects surrounding us seemingly change toward a single direction, which is a theory that has recently come under scrutiny by scientists, by the way. But what all of that leads to is that there is a beginning to what we have right now. There is an expanding universe, a starting point. It does not conclude, none of these arguments, none of these theorems, none of the scientific hypotheses that we have conclude that the universe came into being, into existence out of nothing. That is nowhere. No scientist, there is no scientific consensus on such a thing. There is only a consensus that what we have right now seemingly began to expand from some point. Before that, there was a singularity, and we don't know what was before that. We don't have an answer to that. We can't make assumptions about that. So we can say, yes, the universe that we are in right now began to expand from a certain point, but did it really begin to exist, literally? Nobody can tell. We can't really know that. You can't really make an argument. We can't really make an assertion about that. It will be entirely based on baseless evidence, on baseless arguments without evidence, on merely a series of hypotheses. We don't even know for sure whether the Big Bang is true. We only assume for the time being that is the best explanation given the evidence that objects are separating themselves from each other, and that everything seems to come from a certain point in what we call the universe. So when you make these assumptions and say the universe began to exist, which is not true in the sense that you want to present the argument, but when we come to the idea that since the universe began at some point, something must have created it, fine, you could go ahead and make such an assumption. Unfortunately, it is not entirely based on certain proof, and you don't really know what brought it into existence, and whether there is an endless or a limited number of chains of things that brought it into existence. I mean, maybe it was a god that is under other gods, and they are just playing. Maybe they're just experimenting. Maybe they just want to see if this works. They just want to try out a new scenario. Maybe they don't want to be worshipped. Which, by the way, also debunks the idea of the one God being universal. Not all cultures agree that God is a personal creator who brought everything into existence and who asks for worship. That is so because you believe that it is so according to your religious beliefs.
And one thing you mentioned is that how do you know it's not like a god on top of another, and just an infinite causal series? The first thing I would say is that's just explanatorily superfluous, right? I don't need all of that. If I could suffice with just one cause, one designer, and they're one and the same, Occam's razor or parsimony, then that's again the best explanation, because your explanation, or this possible one you're positing, posits way more entities than mine. Mine just posits one that does all the explanatory work, and so it is the better explanation. That's why I would choose it over those other ones.
That is a misapplied use of logic here in this case. You would not go for the best possible explanation. You would simply go for the explanation that best makes sense to you. Because if you went for the best possible explanation, you would go for that explanation for which you have reasonable evidence. But you don't have evidence that there is only one creator. You only have evidence that there is something, or that there is a creator, or that there is, a reason or a design in this. So your best explanation is not that there is one creator. Your best explanation is that there is a design.
Well, here's the idea. Explanations have virtues, explanatory virtues, and one virtue is simplicity or parsimony, right? And so yours just completely negates any sort of parsimony, because you can posit as many of those creators as you want, but all I'm doing is positing one that does all the work. I'm positing one entity that does all the explanatory work, whereas you would be positing 5, 6, a million, a trillion, infinity that does that explanatory work. That's superfluous. That is explanatorily unvirtuous or non-virtuous, whereas my hypothesis here is more virtuous. And because of that, that is what makes it the better explanation, right?
That is completely subjective, though, because what you are doing, there is no reason to conclude that one being that creates everything and has the might to create everything, and all the might, is a better explanation than multiple beings that might not be almighty or not be superior to everything else. It is only to you subjectively a better explanation, or better or more virtuous, that one is a better explanation than a multitude or an unlimited number of beings. That's the issue. You don't have evidence to suggest that one is a better explanation than the other. You only have evidence, as far as you see it. I don't think there is any evidence to that, but you only have supposed evidence for a design. You don't have an understanding by which we can measure whether one is a better explanation or more virtuous than 5,000 or an unlimited, undefined number.
I think you're confused here. It's not subjective. I'm saying that there's a standard by which some theories are better than others. Some theories meet that standard, some don't. And if one's positing so many different entities to do the same explanatory job that the other theory that just posits one, then there's a sort of asymmetry here, right? Mine posits way less and does the same exact job. That's why we should prefer it, right? Another issue would be if there's like a infinite causal chain, one god on top of the other, then that would violate causal finitism. I don't think that's possible, right? So I think that can be excluded deductively. But again, one of the main arguments I'm making here is that this is the better explanation because it's more simple, right? You're doing all of the explanatory work with a single entity. It's not just because it's better for me. Of course it is better for me, but I think that's also a successful line of reasoning because I'm appealing to simplicity here. That is a theoretical virtue. I'll pass it back.
There's a creaking noise that comes. Is that from you, James? Did you hear that?
That might be me. Yeah, I hear that. That might.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. Is it really loud?
It's happening right now. Yeah, it's just a little bit distracting. That's fine.
Like an old wooden ship.
I'll mute when I'm not talking. There you go.
Are you? Is it like I don't know? Go ahead.
I don't know what it is. It's just a little bit unnerving. But yeah. So again. You say this simplicity according to you. There is no standard based on which we can say that one is simpler than undefined. I think it is much easier since we have no evidence for the quantity of things that we may call originators or gods or creators, to say that one is a simpler explanation or a better explanation than the other. You appeal in order to justify your idea that this is the simplest or the best explanation to certain reasons that are outside of the argument, such as one person creating all of this makes more sense or is more reasonable, is more simple than many people or an undefined number of people creating all these things. Why would you make that assumption to begin with? You're assuming a number to begin with. Why not simply go with undefined, unknown?
Okay, just to unpack this for a bit, it can't be undefined because we know there's at least one. So it's one or more. And so I'm trying to understand what you mean by you can't say it's more simple. Is one more simple than five? Like, is one entity more simplistic than five entities?
I don't know. It could be that five doing everything together is simpler than one. I'm not sure. It's based on how you define simple. It's based on how you define this. Could you, for example, accept the possibility that it is an immense number of creators, or that it is five creators? Do you think it is possible, or do you rule these out entirely?
It would depend on what you mean. If you mean like you have one god or an infinite series of gods, I would rule that out. But if you're saying like you have all of these just existing independently and uncaused, then I wouldn't rule that out. As in saying, I wouldn't say that's impossible a priori, at least. But okay.
Fair enough.
So here's the idea: five doing the same explanatory work as one is less simplistic, right? That's just by definition, because one entity doing all the explanatory work is a better explanation than five doing the exact same explanatory work. You're just adding entities for no reason, right? So according to Occam's razor, we should just shred all of these off until we get to one that does all the work, which is what I'm positing here. A single cause that designs the universe. That's basically the reasoning behind it.
Yeah, I don't see it, and you may say that this is simply my flaw, but I still think that the entire assumption that one is a simpler explanation to things rests on certain reasons that are simply not part of the fundamental idea of the designer behind all of this. It is, again, as I would say, subjective. But you could say this is my mistake. I accept that as such, and we can proceed to the next idea, which is, for example, if you want to move on there, I don't know if you want to say anything else about this. Go ahead.
I guess all I'll say is I think there is a confusion there, because I think one entity doing the explanation instead of five is going to be more simple, because I think there's just an obvious sense in which one is more simple than five. We can move on from there.
Sure, and that's how you see it. I don't see it that way. Maybe I'm mistaken. I don't know. But if we come, for example, to the cosmological argument, it is your idea that the universe came into existence. What do you mean by came into existence?
That it's past finite. That its history, its causal history, does not extend infinitely. I think that's all it means for something to begin to exist. It's past to be finite.
Do you think we have any knowledge which can be proven and supported with evidence that there was nothing before that?
Well, I don't think there was nothing before that. I'm a theist. I mean, I think there was something.
Okay, but
sans the universe.
Yeah, but would you define the creator or the god as something in existence before that? I mean, what I'm talking about is the universe itself. Do you suggest that that nothing existed in place of the universe if we do not count the creator God, for example?
Well, I think it's incoherent to say that nothing existed in the place of the universe, because nothing is just the absence of anything. So to say that nothing existed in its place is just a category error. I'm not sure. It's just, I think, an incoherent sentence.
Which is why do you rule out the idea that there was something always in place, or many things like the universe were always in place, but simply are not always expanding, and ours simply happened to expand from a certain point, from a singularity?
Well, do you know what a singularity is?
Singularity is the absence of time and space.
It's a mathematical description. It's not something that literally exists like a physical object.
I know what it refers to, but we use it in order to refer to a certain state in which you cannot explain or you cannot define time or space, for example.
The idea here is that space-time, right, is past finite, and that's what the Borg-Blanken theorem aims to show by proof of by showing that inflation from eternity isn't possible. That's the goal. And if that's the case, then space-time is past finite. But that's what I need, because all I need for premise 2 is that the universe began to exist. Disambiguate that. What's the universe? Space-time and its contents. Did it begin to exist? If it's past finite, it did. Is it past finite? I think there's scientific evidence for that. And one second, just before you move on, you talk about proving things. I mean, if you mean proof, like as in like sort of like a mathematical proof, that's not what I'm aiming for. I'm aiming to provide evidence for claims and say these are our best explanations, these are our best scientific theories. We should accept this. Mm-hmm. That's basically the idea.
Again, my initial idea about that, my initial criticism about that is a very common one. I'm sure you're aware of it, is that the scientific consensus is not that this is all there is and it began to exist at a certain point. The scientific consensus, as far as we have, because that is all that we can have access to as far as evidence is concerned, is that everything seemingly began to expand from a certain point in the past, because that is what the majority of evidence that we have points at. So everything began to expand from a certain point, which points us at the idea of the Big Bang theory, that everything started from one certain point and continued to expand and is still expanding. The idea behind that, however, is not that everything then, that things then came or popped into existence. So you could not use this as evidence for the argument that something was brought into existence from nothing, such as in a creation, ex nihilo, where God creates everything from nothing. The scientific consensus merely trusts that things began to expand from a certain point, but we don't know anything beyond that. It is still a possibility that this is merely one of many such cases of which we have no further knowledge as of yet, because all we have is the observable universe, which we mostly can observe, but also we can't really investigate and inspect it.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the idea here behind the Borg-Blanken theorem, though, is that it couldn't, for this reason, right? And this reason is that you'd have faster than light speeds. But because that's not possible, then we say inflation couldn't have been occurring from eternity. So there's a finite past here. And so do you accept or reject that space-time is finite towards the past?
As far as we define space and time, as of now, sure, yes, but this doesn't rule out certain other theories of how exactly this expansion began, to happen, or for example, this doesn't rule out different ideas of a multiverse, for example. They simply seem more, some would say, logically not as good of an explanation, but they can't be ruled out.
Okay, so look, that it began to exist, or that it began to start inflation, or however you want to cash it out, that this thing began, that this just means that there's some sort of cause behind it if we accept premise 1. One thing you mentioned is that we can't rule out things like a multiverse. I can't rule out that there's a demon under my bed, forget under my bed, that there's a Cartesian demon that's deceiving me, and perhaps you don't exist, maybe James doesn't exist, maybe nobody except me exists, and this demon is convincing me that everybody exists. I can't rule it out, but it's not reasonable to believe that. I have no reason to believe it, right? And you deny the claim that I'm making because you have no reason to believe it.
Sure.
So the idea here is that just saying we can't rule this out, it's not informative, right? We want to make informative claims.
I understand. The issue is, I'm not saying, okay, there are different explanations, one of them is true. No, I'm merely saying there are different explanations. Some of them could be true. Maybe yours is true. These are possibilities, right? We're playing playing with possibilities, with certain explanations, with hypotheses. This is how philosophy has gone forever. I am merely accepting your idea, your proposal, as one possible explanation among many. The scientific consensus that we have right now, this is where the scientific consensus lies, is that the universe as we see it, as we have it right now, most likely, according to the established scientific theory, which basically just translates to explanation, a scientific explanation, is that the universe that we have began to expand from a certain point. Now, the evidence which brought us to this idea is still not entirely firm. It is still changing today, but that is all we know. All we know is that the universe that we have right now in which we are began to expand from a certain point. That's the best explanation. But you can't make further assumptions about how and why that happened and then expect people to simply, take that as evidence and believe in that. That's all I'm saying about it.
Okay, so a comment here, you bring up, for example, the multiverse explanation, but that wouldn't be an explanation for the conclusion of the KCA, because what the Kalam argument is just saying is that there's a cause, right? You might bring up multiverse in objection to the fine-tuning argument. See, but the multiverse is not an explanation and not an alternative to the conclusion of the Kalam argument. So that's a point to be made. And second, I think there's a sort of like taxi cab kind of situation here where it's always like, trust the science until the science says something that might entail a conclusion we don't want to agree with. And so, for example, you might want to accept evolution because that's where the consensus lies right now. You might want to accept all kinds of theories where the consensus lies. But I don't think you're going to cast the same sort of skepticism over these theories. Maybe you will, and that would be consistent, and I respect that. But are you going to?
Of course. For example, when we talk about the Big Bang Theory, I explicitly said, I believe many times, that this is the best explanation that we have, right. Simply because I do not say that this is 100% the truth. I don't hold that as a conviction. I'm merely saying this is the best explanation. In fact, I often say we don't really know. It is entirely possible that this is not true, that there is something else that is true. It is entirely possible that what you're telling me, as absurd as I think it is right now, turns out to be true, and I'll be like, holy hell, I guess it is true.
That's okay. That's cool. So best explanations as rational agents, do you agree with this proposition? As rational agents, we should always accept the best explanation for the data sets or the observations we make.
Depends on how you define accept. I'm very skeptical in terms of how far we want to go with accepting a certain explanation or accepting
Believing
a certain theory.
To be true.
Again, depends. When we talk about the best explanation of why the universe is moving the way it's moving, I think it is currently the best explanation, and I would accept it as most likely true that the Big Bang is true. But when we talk about life on other planets, I would say, hey, it is the best explanation that life exists on other planets, but I cannot say that this is what I accept as true. It is simply reasonable based on what we observe so far.
That's great, because remember what I said earlier. What we're looking for here is premises more plausible than their negations. I take that from Craig. Mm-hmm. We want premises more plausible than their negations. And I think that's what I've provided here. Two premises that are more plausible than their negation in the Kalam argument. And fine-tuning, I guess, is a bit far more contentious for you. But so do you accept then that you should believe in the conclusion of the Kalam argument that the universe began to exist and has a cause?
I'm not sure, because I don't know how we exactly define... here's the thing. I could say... it is very likely that the universe came into existence based on our understanding of coming into existence in the argument, and that it has a cause, but I don't know if this cause is something that brings existence altogether into existence, or if it is something outside of that, as we have discussed. So what we are left with is, even if I did accept a cause, I don't know what the cause possibly could be, and there is no reason to say it is a personal being. When it then comes to the fine-tuning argument, I would say we have no idea to come to the understanding that it was a certain being or just one person.
Okay. I think this is a lot of progress here. So then the next issue is bridging the gap, right? So what would make that cause God, right? I think there's two ways I could go about it, and one would be combining the argument. So if the universe began to exist and has a cause, and then proceed to say the universe is fine-tuned, and if the universe began to exist, has a cause, and is fine-tuned, then the best explanation would be that one entity is doing all of the explanatory work. And so you'd get to a single entity that's an agent because it's doing an intelligent one and a powerful one that's doing this fine tuning. And from Kalam, yeah, that is me.
We've got to wrap up once you finish this sentence and go into the closing statements. Just get you guys out of here on time.
Yeah. So last thing I wanted to say is from Kalam, you get that it's spaceless because it created space-time, which is where you get physicality from, right? Dimensionality, so on and so forth. And it's timeless because time or change in this sense, metric time, it's from the universe.